So somewhere in the late 2000s, early 2010s, there was an almost anti being prepared movement going on, right? I perhaps added to it a bit more than I should have unintentionally, where people were abandoning menus, like having some sort of like schedule in place when it comes to the way they ate for their goals. And a lot of this was infused because of the if it fits your macros movement, where I guess a lot of things, I mean, people were partially wrong, but people were like, for meal timing doesn't matter, which is not entirely accurate either. You don't have to eat the same thing every day. A lot of misguided energy in some ways, I think. We'll sort through all that, especially since I think as a company, we were like kind of in the forefront of flexible dieting. And you know how it goes, man. You put something out there and you're like, that's not what I meant either. But what if it fits your macros to me truly was just being able to really customize something for you and your life situation so that you are more likely to achieve your goals. But by no means did it mean like, hey, just wake up and like chaos. And now you're eating olive oil at night, drinking olive oil to hit your fat intake at the end of the day. So now in modern times, I think things have died down a little bit. And it's funny because the culture has actually swayed back towards using some sort of system. But the difference now is that like people make their own systems. I think like most folks got the essence of what it was that we were trying to get out when flexible dieting became a thing. We talked about this briefly before we got on here. Like both of you, have your set meals. And I think most of our listeners, they probably have some very distinct patterns that take place, say, Monday through Friday. And then there's the weekend. But I guess the difference is that it's self-inflicted. They got there on their own. So yeah, you, Jeff, I think especially you, since you have some goals coming up, you're dieting for a number of shows this year. Do you just drink olive oil at the end of the night, or how do you do it?
Tablespoon. Like a baby. No, man, I don't do that. No. I have a system structure in place for myself. What's interesting too is like if we go back to when you're talking, when it's your macros, flexible dieting, like if you recall, when I came to you guys, I was total bro. It was meal plans and only certain foods, certain times. So I was good with that system. And then when I got introduced to flexible dieting, it seemed like chaos to me because I was like, what do you mean I can eat different foods? What do you mean I could eat at different times, or it doesn't have to be a set number of meals? So to me, it just seemed like, man, this is not very organized. It's not very structured. And then once I started to get into it, it took me a good 2 to 3 weeks to really kind of grasp like how to actually start incorporating this. And it was actually like my mentality almost started to shift towards like, what can I get away with? Almost like I can eat any food I want. Like, and all of a sudden, like my food choices start to go from like really, really healthy to all of a sudden getting a little more on the quote unquote unhealthy side, not your typical bodybuilding foods. You were the Pop-Tart guy, Alberto, at one point. Like everybody knew you for Pop-Tarts. Well, everybody started knowing me for protein cakes. Like, all these sugars and sauces and all this stuff that's being put on these protein cakes. It's almost like I went from one extreme all the way to the other. And it took me a while to kind of, grasp those concepts. Eventually, I got good at it, got in great shape. And then now here we are, we circle back around. It's almost like I have a combination of two systems going on at once. Because I've learned how to, like, in a sense, customize my approach. And a lot of what I do, it's based off of satiety and where I'm going to need energy. So as far as like the number of meals, the food sources, like certain food sources obviously can help with satiety, things like that. So it's kind of in a sense like I've taken a lot of experience from the past with the bro days to the flexible dieting days, and that kind of like combined it now to kind of in a sense try to find self-mastery. And that shifts too, depending on where I'm at in my process. Now I'm getting deeper into prep. I'm getting a little on the leaner side. So I have to be even more strategic as far as how I go about like creating that type of structure for myself where the adherence level is going to be really high. I'm going to be able to sustain it. And at the same time, enjoy what I'm still doing, like not feeling like I'm deprived or suffering. Because I know if I go a good, like 2-3 more months of prep, if I totally deprived, like I'm scared of what's going to happen at the other side of prep. Am I going to want to just eat a bunch of crap, gain a bunch of weight too quickly, and start to become a little more unhealthy, eating disorders, those types of things? So I kind of think of all those things while I'm going through the process.
Steve, how you handle your business?
For me personally, like just having a plan and being prepared is like one of the most important things that I need to do to like have a successful week. It's like hit my fruit, veggie, and protein goals. So like regardless of whether I'm trying to maintain weight, gain weight, or lose weight, like I always have some sort of structure. And I don't know, like personally, like the way that I do it is like on just on the weekend, I'll just kind of map out what I want for like I have like 3 big meals. I'll just map out, hey, what's my breakfast, lunch, and dinner? I'll just do the old school, like go to the store, get my stuff, come home, prep it, so I'm good for the week. And I've just found that as long as I'm choosing foods that sound good to me, I don't mind following a structure. I think compared to like the old school meal plan, because like when I'm working with a client, like I'm always trying to describe the difference between like this new kind of new age structure versus like old school structure is like before it was like, like old school meal plans, it was like we were forced to eat foods that we didn't necessarily want. It was like you just had to eat these foods for whatever reason. They were low calorie, high protein, whatever. But like the difference is like if you're choosing foods that you like and that sound good, then following structure is really not that hard. So I mean that's like I said, for me, I like having a structure on this kind of stuff, and I don't know, it makes my week way easier. I hate having to like get off work and decide, okay, what I want to eat, or like at lunchtime, like waste time, like rummaging around the kitchen, like trying to just build a meal on the fly. I'd rather just know what I want. Like it's already prepped, just eat it and like just be able to throw on like some YouTube and just like actually relax versus having to think about what I'm going to eat. So yeah, so I definitely use it. And with clients too, it's like, it's like huge. Like the people who make consistent progress have a plan and they prep their meals. Like that's like a key difference between like those who are making consistent progress and those who are struggling. Like I almost guarantee like when somebody is struggling with me that they're not doing that. Like they're trying to just wing it every day on the fly, like wake up and just like as they go throughout the day, try to hit their targets, but they have no real plan. So yeah.
Yeah. It's funny that you, going back to what Jeff said, because I remember being on self-inflicted menus, things that, it's like, okay, this is going to be my breakfast, this is going to be my lunch. And it was way different than when I was trying to follow something that was predetermined by someone else. It's like, why do I have to have grapefruit in the morning? That sounds awful, or just like simply the one menu I followed like in my lifting career. It wasn't made by myself. It was, I had to eat 6 times. So that was hard because it didn't fit well into some days. There was times where it's like, wow, what if I want to go to sleep early? Like, what do I do? What if I wake up a little late? Shoot, that means I have to eat like, I don't know, every hour and 45 minutes or something to make these things go. So eventually, obviously, that didn't last too long. It was for a botched prep, by the way. I was using this old system that, in hindsight, I look at it and I'm like, wow, so many unnecessary rules when it came to the core principles, because the principles are the same, but it's like how you practice it. Like that's where I think real coaching comes in, where it's not a bad diet because you're following a menu. if the athlete has some say. Like, for example, for you, Steve, 3 meals a day happens to work really well in flow with most days. For me, 6 meals a day, that was ridiculous. Like, for me, kind of similar to you, 304 is kind of what I go through. And even though I don't necessarily prepare much more than maybe just a par of like the proteins that I need for the week, I make sure I have the Greek yogurt that I'm going to require this week and maybe some chicken thighs. Even though I'm not regimented in that, like, this is what I'm eating, meal 1, 2, 3, there's a pattern there. Like, if someone were to follow me for a week, it's like, oh, you kind of almost always eat this breakfast. And if you don't eat this breakfast, there's like 3 or 4 other breakfast variations you use. So at the end, we all kind of default to something that is a little bit more regimented. And I think a lot of the Generation 1 flexible dieters, that's what they ended up doing anyways. But like Jeff mentioned, they were doing it with some not so well thought out food options just for the sake of saying that, like, I'm doing this.
Like for me, it was like, oh, this actually tastes good. Like this tastes like really good. So the taste buds was actually guiding me, not so much like the strategy part of it. Like, okay, if I eat this food, whether let's say it's Skittles, for example, and I'm gonna have an oatmeal, like digestion wise, and Steve, you can tell me because you're the nutritionist of the bunch. Oatmeal is going to take a little bit longer to digest. So it's probably going to be a bit more satiating. So especially like if we're contest prepping or we're trying to lean down, like you go through stages of that, like the hunger levels, satiety, energy level, all that is going to get more challenging as you go. So if you're trying to get away with something, then you're not only like, what you're doing is you're caving into like just an immediate satisfaction of the taste of these Skittles. But after that, like you're setting up like a little bit of failure because it's like, yes, you got to plan ahead like you do, Steve. Like, okay, I got this meal, this meal, and this meal. This is what I'm going to eat. But if you're not strategizing, even further as far as food sources and things like that, you're going to get yourself into hot water. And that's what I kind of learned going through that prep with the flexible dieting approach was that I didn't have those boxes checked off. So I think it's super important that, it's like we're setting up like the big picture plan, but also like within that, you got to pay attention to a little bit more of the details as well to make sure you're highly successful.
I think that's what that planning and structure gives me, because if I just go on the fly, then I'm going to be like, I'm just not going to randomly like eat my veggies, which means I'm going to be hungrier later. So it's just kind of what you're saying,
yeah,
Jeff.
How many see people come home from work, right? Like they're tired. They don't have dinner, like they don't have nothing prepared. And then they're driving home and they're like, man, I'm like really hungry right now. That fast food looks really good. Screw it. I'm going to go in there and I'm going to eat some tacos or whatever. So that's where people go wrong. Like you said, they don't have something prepared ahead of time. Like I don't have all my food prepared in advance, but kind of like Berto, I know in my head, like what breakfast looks like. I have usually like 1 or 2 go-tos. Lunch is like same thing. I have like two go-tos, and then dinner right now I got about 3 or 4 go-tos. But it's always like a lean protein source, some type of vegetable, and it's either some type of like starch. And I rotate like within a few meals. So I kind of have a skeleton of kind of how that day is going to go. And I follow it pretty much like 90% of the time, during the week. That's what it kind of looks like Monday through Friday. The weekend's a little bit different because my wife is very spontaneous. I wake up on a Saturday morning. I have no clue what we're going to do until she says, hey, we're going here, we're going there. And I'm like, where am I going? I don't know what to do. But once I kind of know like more or less how that day might flow, then that's where the flexible dieting skills come into place in good decision making. And then I have a buffer system for myself. So if I know I'm going to be out and about for a day, if it's, we're going to be gone around lunchtime or dinner or both, then I'm like, okay, chances are we're probably going to go to some type of restaurant to eat. Well, if I create a buffer before I leave, meaning let's not eat a whole lot, keep things really light, then I'm kind of pushing calories towards the latter part of the day. So it does give me a little more wiggle room when I am at a restaurant. But even if I do have a lot of calories left, I'm not just like automatically going, well, I'm going to choose the greasiest thing on the menu because I can get away with it. It's more like, okay, let me still pay attention to like my protein intake, keep fats relatively in check, don't order too much grease, that type of thing. And at the end of the day, I'm basically kind of nailing down what I need to do. Like I'm doing two things. One, I'm staying true to my bodybuilding goals. And then two, I'm still being Jeff, the husband, the dad, and all that, because I'm not sitting there like pulling my phone out and thinking about like, okay, I got to make sure I'm hitting these macros or whatever. So that's kind of how I like go about that type of thing.
I think you both made an important distinction that I'm glad you did, because when I described how I do things, it maybe sounded wrong. Like I don't put it all into individual Tupperwares and like stack the whole thing up. It's
Yes,
more
you
of
do.
like
I've
too
seen
much.
your Tupperware, Steve.
That's too, not anymore. I used to. It's too much now. It's more of like prepping the protein in advance, prepping the veggies in advance, and doing that kind of stuff. And sometimes it's like, this week for dinner, I'm going to go to Chipotle. And like, that's the plan. Like, I know all week I'm doing Chipotle for dinner. Like, that's as loose as like I can be with it. I just have to kind of have a rough idea of what I'm going to have. But I'm glad that you said that, because it does make it sound like I was just like packaging everything up and like stacking it, which some people love that, but I know a lot of people don't like that. Like, that's just a lot of, I don't know, too structured, because then you feel really like you can burn out on foods really quick. But even if you leave a meal like 80% done, that kind of gives you enough like flexibility where you don't feel like you have to stick to that meal. But the skeleton, the base of it's still there.
I'm like I like to be efficient with my diet. Like, I don't like to spend a ton of time in the kitchen. So like in the morning, I kind of realized like, you know what, I do good with a fruit smoothie, like have some whey, put it in the blender with some ice, and then I get frozen fruit. Because one, I don't want to go to the store constantly and buy fresh fruit all the time. Call it lazy or what you will, but I'm like, man, it's just easier for me to go to Costco, buy some frozen berries, some frozen fruit, and then just throw it in the blender. And I'm like, breakfast literally for me, it takes me not even 5 minutes to make. Like, I don't have to think about it. There's no food focus. I'm drink it, I'm done, carry on with my day. Same thing for lunch. It's like, it's usually some type of chicken salad, or it's like grilled chicken breast, like something that I don't have to spend like a lot of time in the kitchen thinking about it. And I don't have to like spend an entire Sunday food prepping, like spending my whole day in the kitchen, like cooking up all this chicken, fish, or whatever, and then separating it all, then having it like that. So I kind of have my own like individual system that I like to use. That's taken experience and time to develop. But I think that helps a lot of people though, like as far as like creating your own type of system as a coach. Like when I sit down with somebody, you got to learn like what their lifestyle is like. Sometimes like people have things in check, like they have like their own little system that's pretty solid, but oftentimes they don't, and they need help organizing. So maybe it does look rigid at first, while I have like, okay, you're going to eat this many times. You've seen some of my protocols, Steve. It's like, it's kind of like even at first, and then the goal after that is for them to learn where their satiety levels are throughout the day, where their energy levels are, and then shifting things to cater to that. Because sometimes you could be more hungry at other parts of the day. It's like, okay, let's start shifting food more there. So that, as a coach, that's what I like to do, is like really dive into someone's like life context.
Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez popping in real quick to tell you all about our latest course in the 3DMJ Vault titled Bodybuilding Program Design. This course starts off with over 2 hours of material from Dr. Eric Helms, our Chief Science Officer, who delivers all the evidence and theory to teach you exactly why and how to set up your training volume, intensity, and frequency for maximum results. Then, Coach Alberto Nunez will share 3 full example training programs he's created, so you can see how the principles play out in action based on whether you want to emphasize your upper body, your lower body, or create something a bit more balanced. And lastly, Coach Brad Loomis will show you how to take those programs and track them in an interactive, customizable spreadsheet that you can download and tailor to your specific plan. By watching this course and studying the principles, we're confident you'll know and understand more than like 99% of the lifters at your gym. You'll also be free to intelligently adjust and tweak your training plan without ever having to start from scratch again. Bodybuilding Program Design is now the 20th course in the 3DMJ Vault, which is our online learning platform of organized video-based education for serious lifters. You can become a Vault VIP member to get access to every single one of those courses for just $16.99 per month or $79.99 per year. This means that once you complete this foundational course, you'll have access to everything else you need to expand on your training education, like our advanced deload guide, our lagging body parts course, and so much more. You'll also have access to our quick start guide, along with the entire 40 plus videos in the lifting library to select the right exercises to fit your newly built customized training split. And lastly, additionally, VIP members also get access to our suite of nutrition setup courses too. That includes the Calculating Your Calories course, Calculating Your Macros course, Sustainable Fat Loss, and tons of other great resources built into the subscription. So go to 3dmjvault.com and sign yourself up today. That's 3dmjvault.com to get all access. Thank you so much for listening and enjoy the rest of the show.
So I've said this before. That it's almost like in your fitness journey, you have to take many courses. Like there's the macro course that you took, right? You don't want to be there forever, like playing Tetris, but it's a good skill to have because it has come in handy when you have to do things on the fly on the weekends, for example, right? And then there's like maybe, I don't know, the bro menu like course you took where you're like, okay, maybe it taught me how to be disciplined in some ways, but this is definitely not how I want to live the rest of my life. And I think it's like all these many chapters that like you experienced over the course of your bodybuilding, they at the end kind of end up creating a plan that fits you best. I mean, shoot, sometimes like I exposed myself once to, it was a protein sparing modified diet for like 10 days just because I wanted to try it, just to see what it felt like. Cause I had a lot of athletes that had done something similar to that. And, or at some point, like I even want to try a ketogenic diet or even a vegan diet, because we do get athletes that are vegan, you know, and it kind of, it exposes me to like what the landscape might look like for them. So yeah, at the end, I think it's important to expose yourself to a little bit of everything. Like this next prep, I think even though I didn't track last time, it almost seems like a demotion. I think I want to try like the menu-based dieting simply because I don't want to think about it. Like Steve does it where every meal he eats, it's almost like a little win. You know, like if maybe that morning wasn't going so well and that second meal that morning kind of changes your mode where it's like, okay, I'm taking care of business. Let's get back into that workflow and continue with that momentum. I like certain facets of that, of being like that regimented the way a lot of, I'd say still the majority of competitive bodybuilders are. So yeah, at the end, like your nutrition kind of changes with you and your needs. And there was a time where maybe my chaotic, if it fits your macros approach might have been the course I needed to take. But yeah, like I think as long as you make it fit into your life and not the other way around, what system you use hardly matters. Like right now, my system is I kind of eat the same things first 3 meals, and then last meal of the day is like whatever she's cooking. And if she doesn't want to cook, then it's something else, I guess. But it's what fits right now. And so yeah, I think people start kind of like with training splits, like we went over that before. They start on like the wrong side. It's like whether it's like the carnivore diet, the ketogenic diet, the my favorite bodybuilders, like menu plan, whatever. They take those systems and they plug them into their situation when it should be the other way around. Like, you know, your goals, what's your schedule look like, what sort of obstacles come up frequently for you, like whether it's hunger, whether it's scheduling.
What about like I think what's important is you're willing to explore something. It's like it's the unknown, right? But your experience. So you know what's the worst that can happen if it doesn't work too well for you. It's like, okay, let me explore some more and find something that does. And you know nothing's going to be catastrophic. It's not like all of a sudden you're going to wither away. But with people who are newer or even intermediate, it's like there's a fear of like, if I don't eat X number of meals, or if I'm not spacing my protein out this way, like all these rules that seem to be in place with bodybuilding, like, and maybe Steve can touch on something like this. It's like, how important is it to set the structure up based on like set number of meals, making sure that your protein is spread out, like all these things, Steve, like what's the importance of that as far as making sure that's kind of prioritized versus like I'm trying to set my system up to where I can get the best adherence, maybe the most enjoyment out of it. Like where's the balance with that?
You're talking about from like a science-based perspective, like
Yeah,
trying
because
to have
as bodybuilders, we try to be as optimal as we possibly can, and we fear if we're not being optimal, we're going to shortchange our progress. It's going to go slow, or we got regression. Like, so that's the perspective. Like, the individual right now is kind of listening to this. Well, what am I going to do with all this? I want to make sure I'm doing everything right.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, there's very few, like, it doesn't take much to make a plan, like, pretty dang solid. I mean, I would say try to get a good serving of protein at least 3 times a day. Make sure you're going into your training well fed and you're not hungry. Make sure you're structuring your calories in a way where you sleep well. And with that protein, if you could get, a chunk of that a couple hours before and a couple hours after your training. Other than that, I mean, that's like, the rest of that, it can be pretty flexible. I mean, I have other like guidelines that I use and that I recommend, but they're not things somebody has to do. Like when I'm helping somebody like put together an eating routine, I'm like, okay, try to get like a fruit or a vegetable at all your main meals. Try to get a good serving of protein at all your main meals. Try to go no more than 5 hours without eating. Like, of course, we know that like somebody can go more than 5 hours and they're fine. I've just found that most people, like, kind of if they're going more than 5 hours, they tend to get really hungry and overeat. Or if they eat to that, every 3 to 5 hour range, their appetite's pretty in check and they're never getting to that ravenous state where they just like completely blow their calories out of the water. So, those just basic things do a lot of like fruit or veggie at each meal, good serving of protein at each meal, good serving of protein at least 3 times a day, going into your training well fed and structuring your calories so you can sleep well. I mean, that, and the rest of that is just, like you said, Jeff, at the beginning, like just choosing foods that will keep you full, which for a lot of people is just trial and error. There's also a lot of like common sense. Like most people probably know that like oatmeal is going to keep them more full than Skittles, but there'll be other stuff where they might not think like, oh, like potatoes are actually pretty filling. Like I've always heard potatoes are like, really high calorie and they're like not good to eat on a diet, but like a lot of times when people try potatoes, like actually that's pretty filling and they're actually not that many calories if we don't load them down with like butter and sour cream and stuff. So yeah, I'd say those are my basic guidelines and just that trial and error of trying different foods and seeing what keeps you full.
Steve, how about there's a lot of folks who, even when they have a schedule that seems to work on most days, an eating schedule with the right foods and all that, the snacking for some folks can be an issue. What sort of systems have you put in place, like for when people have a snack attack?
I think the first thing I do is try to describe like the role of snacking in fat loss. I think a lot of us when we start this, like we think that we have to eat so many times per day to keep our metabolism going. Of course, we know now that that's not true. And so like when I describe snacking now, and there's even a video on the 3DMJ channel I made, I think it was over a year ago, called Strategic Snacking. But it was basically like, if we have a snack, there should be a purpose to it. It shouldn't just be like, I need to eat to keep my metabolism going. It should either be I'm eating because it's going to help my training, or I'm eating to keep myself from getting too hungry so I don't binge at a later meal. So that's my first thing is like, hey, let me just explain the role of snacking and clear up any like myths around that. Other than that, like in terms of like getting into the nitty gritty of like snacks, like, and you guys have probably found this as well, like if you're really hungry, it doesn't take that much food to like curb that a little bit. Like you can be starving and have like an apple or two, and like that can get you by for another hour or two until it only costs you 100 to 200 calories. So that's what I tell people, and especially from like the bodybuilding community. Like I think, and I know I had this mindset for a long time of like I thought I had to have protein every time I ate. And like if I wasn't having protein every time I ate, like there was something wrong with that meal. But now it's like, no, it's like I can have something that's just like an apple and some nuts, and that's fine. Like, because the goal of that was just to keep me full. As long as I'm getting a good chunk of protein, at least 3 times a day, 3 to 5 times a day, like that's solid. So I'd say breaking any, unnecessary guidelines you have around snacks and just knowing it's okay to eat just carbs or just fats or a combination of both, or eating something that's whole purpose is just to get you by for a couple hours, even if it's not a protein dose or a protein feeding that's enough to like really stimulate muscle protein synthesis, like not getting stressed about that and being like, no, like that's not the goal for this meal. The goal for this meal is just to get me by a few more hours. So.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny you say apples, because partially it's because I've trained myself to experience and see it this way. But to me, I don't know, I guess what I consider a snack over the years has evolved greatly. Like a snack used to be, I don't know, a candy bar or something of that nature. Whereas like now, and I say this like with pure honesty, like I much prefer some sort of fruit. Like when I get fruit, like that's usually what it is for me, especially fruit that like, you can take with you. Like that's my snack. And that was, I think, the issue with a lot of the, I guess, Gen 1, if it fits your macros, was the fact that whatever you eat routinely is like what your palate eventually wants the most. And it can get to the point where like nothing really hits the spot. But when you kind of bring down your ceiling a little bit when it comes to how much pleasure you can derive from your foods, like an appropriate level of pleasure. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, had an amazing cheeseburger yesterday and that was great, but there's always a part of me that can't wait to get back to like my usual foods, but yeah, so I asked about the snacking because that is often an issue whenever I have athletes who want to transition away from whether it's a concrete menu of some sort or some sort of system where they're too closely like monitoring calories and they want to work a little bit more on like the habit side of things. Like that is an issue. And one thing you mentioned is like the 5-hour window. Like that's a huge one. It's like, I think for all of us, like even now, and especially like if I'm in a situation like Jeff, if I go 5 hours without eating and I'm thrown into a restaurant, like there's a bigger chance that I might be committing some nutritional crimes during that sitting. On that note, one thing when it comes to establishing new habits is most people kind of come with their own habits anyways. Like people who don't think about nutrition at all, same thing. If you follow them over the course of a week, it's like you always have Cheetos like during lunch or something like that. And it's really just about reestablishing new habits. And it's crazy how quickly those habits like just become habits. But I guess what does matter is that whatever you are assigning to the athlete or whatever they're assigning to themselves when as they're creating their eating schedule, that it doesn't veer too far away from maybe what their baseline habits are to begin with. So for example, if someone doesn't eat breakfast until maybe a bit later in the day, that's not something that I will necessarily change unless I feel that that's leading to some behavior later in the day that we want to avoid. So when I create, for example, like my bodybuilding menu next year when I prep, it's probably going to be 3 meals or something like that, because 6 meals would be like way out in the distance, like from what I do already habitually.
That's a great point, because I think about hearing you to talk about, you're basically, hey, people have their own set of habits, their own routine already, and we're just trying to kind of optimize that. Like, it just makes me think about like when I'm helping somebody build something, I'm like, okay, what time do you wake up? What time do you eat your first meal? What time do you eat your second meal? What time do you, and I literally just get their current routine like on paper. And then I'm like, okay, can we get it to where there's no more than 5 hours between these things? Can we get a serving of protein here, here, and here? Can we get fruit or veggie with all these things? And like you said, I try to just use the structure they already have and just do those little details within it and only change it if like you said, I feel like, or like you feel that like something about that current structure is
way off,
going way off, and it's
Yeah.
causing him to overeat later. I think it was a great point.
Yeah. I think we get this with like contest prep, like first time contest preppers are just really new to it. Like, because they're not used to feeling hungry, and it's inevitable. If you're in a deficit at some point, you're going to be hungry. You're going to feel it. I don't care what you do. You can strategize all you want, and it helps to a degree, but at certain points, like no matter what you do, it's going to be there. And oftentimes, like, they just mentally don't have the capacity to deal with that. So they start doing some crazy stuff to try to fight that. It's just making things worse. And a big one is like pushing calories, whether it's pushing it like towards the end of the day or it's pushing it like first thing in the morning or what have you. Like, then they have these long stretches where they're not eating, like they're not getting enough calories. And then they wonder why they're suffering. Like, they can't function at work. They're lethargic. Performance is down. Recovery's not all that great. So those are like the big things that, like you said, I look for. It's like, okay, what are these like big nuts and bolts that are just way out of whack? Like, let me try to fix this and organize it and make it better for them. But it's the little things within it. Like, they do already have like habits in place, but sometimes like those habits are just not in line with what's going to make things more effective and efficient for them.
I think that's what's helpful about our role is like, you know, it is like we get stuck in our own habits, so we don't even see them anymore. And so the benefit of like somebody else looking at it is like, oh wow, you're probably doing these things that aren't that helpful, and they're just so used to doing those things, don't even realize that that's causing issues down the line.
And then, I mean, just like layering that, it's like a long stretch without eating. Then when they do go to eat late at night, it's like they want to have this large meal that lacks nutrients because now their taste buds are taking over. Like, there's not enough fiber in there. There's not enough micronutrients in there. So, I mean, you do that, rinse and repeat that week after week after week, you're going to start getting some deficiencies. And it could compound. Yeah.
And at least like digestive issues. Now the person's going to bed like bloated and they can't sleep because they were trying to hit their protein, fruit and veggie goals like all at the end of the day and like cram it all into one meal right before bed. And then because they had all that food right before bed, they slept bad and they wake up and they're still full from the night before. And so now it's like kind of creates this little cycle thing. And
it's all because they want to have this big meal while watching the Food Network at night. That Bobby Flay's whipping up some awesome tasting food that's probably not bodybuilder friendly.
Yeah, for me personally, there was certain segments of flexible dieting that they just made dieting harder. The fact that so many meals were so open-ended, like I didn't necessarily know what I was going to have. And a lot of that stuff was even, I'd say for show. For a lot of folks, actually, like if you were to be in close proximity to them, you'd see that they kind of eat the same way anyways. Or that's what they would end up doing towards the harder stages of a goal, especially like a fat loss goal. And, you know, the cookie or the Pop-Tart that they were throwing up on social media was just like for the show, you could say.
So I feel like everything we've talked about so far, you could put probably into two boxes. One, we're all advocating for the benefits of having a structure, having a plan. And two, we went through a bunch of tips for how to build that structure, how to look at your own schedule and how to put that down on paper and some guidelines you can follow. Don't have to follow, but just some things that we've noticed that work well for most people for keeping their appetite under control, helping them to sleep well and have good training sessions. So with that said, do you guys think this stuff is just important during fat loss phases and during preps, or do you think this is important year round?
So I think it's important to establish all these good habits, right? Especially if someone's new and currently their daily flow isn't, let's say, all that great. Like, things are just very inconsistent, sporadic, just very unstable. Like, I don't think it's a good idea to take someone like that, whether it's just, you know, they just want to lose weight or they want to start a contest prep, to kind of throw them into the fire of like, okay, you got to change your habits like a complete 180. And on top of it, we're going to put you in a deficit. Because when you get into a deficit, even the most skilled bodybuilders, when they get into a deficit, the stress levels amplify and they're not always 100% with adherence and the sustainability. So to throw someone who's new, relatively new into the fire, probably not a good idea. So I think like it's probably a better idea to work on habits, setting that system up, but not necessarily being in a deficit. I mean, if you do end up losing a little bit of weight, through diet, through the habit change, great. But I think you need to monitor too, like what's that rate of loss looking like, and just making sure that their overall stress levels from the deficit isn't going to amplify where it starts to unravel all those good habits that they're putting in place. Because, we're bodybuilders, we've seen it, where people lose weight maybe a little too fast and their adherence just goes down. And then it leads to binges. And, from there, we don't want it to lead into something even worse, like eating disorders and things like that. So I think it's important that we're not purposely trying to put ourselves in a deficit. If someone who's relatively new to creating this type of structure for themselves.
So you're saying like ideally somebody would make these changes and set the structure first before they ever even attempt a fat loss phase.
Correct.
Like that. Okay.
Let's learn the skill of like just having good habits first before we start diving into like creating a structure for an actual deficit. Because you're going to be able to adhere to it better and sustain it a lot better because you have the tools already. You don't want to like put some karate. I like to use karate analogies lately. It's like, we're getting into white belt territory here. And now you want to go from white belt to black belt. It's like, let's start at white belt, accomplish that, move to yellow, and so on. So I think it just has like the system of like creating that structure, right? Like the menu, what we're talking about. It's like you also have to create a structure for the deficit as well. So there's a lot of layers to this. I just think we don't want to like have, 1 foot too far out in front.
For most people, their habits tend to be so off sometimes that just these habit building phases end up creating fat loss that we weren't even necessarily expecting. And then highly advantageous because then when you do start an explicit deficit, like it's not as big of a pivot, right? You just remove a few things here and there. And at this point, they will know themselves better as a dieter, as a person who eats food relative to when they are in a hypocaloric state, because things happen when you're dieting and you've lost some weight that it's not a good representation of what you usually are under most circumstances. And yeah, it's that important to have, because for us, like our habits, they almost feel like a reflex. Like we don't think about it. I think to the average person, they might say like, damn, you're so disciplined with like all these foods that you have pre-cooked and how you're able to eat this healthy breakfast every day at the same time. But in reality, it's just us doing us at this point. And when we decide to drop a few pounds, like the initial steps are, they, for the most part, leave our life mostly intact. I know for me, when I go from something that's weight maintenance or a slow gain and I want to lose weight, I know that, for example, because of like my habits, that in the morning, I am not all that hungry. So typically, I know that I can remove a lot of calories from there. And essentially, like even during a prep, almost all my caloric adjustments come from my morning meal, to the point where it's just protein in some form. And then the rest of my day looks very similar to my off season. And this is something that I find very easy to stick to, because again, all these other things that I do that seem like, okay, this requires a lot of discipline, they're just things I do at this point. So setting up these habits make it so that the path to whatever the next increment for you physique-wise is, it's the path of least resistance, as opposed to trying to change everything at once. But yeah, majority of my athletes, as soon as, especially the ones that have been through some stuff, don't eat enough fruits, don't eat enough vegetables, they don't know themselves as an eater, just kind of playing with the habit side of things usually ends up getting them fat loss they weren't expecting, and they're less likely to rebound eventually because this becomes their default settings.
I got, I guess, two thoughts on that. One was, I think you highlighted something that I just want to highlight as well, is like that using your hunger to help you kind of set up your structure of like, you're somebody who's naturally not hungry in the morning. Like, a lot of people have like heard myths, they got to have like a big breakfast or whatever, but like just using that, there is no rule around that, and using your hunger to help guide how you set up your structure. I think that was a cool, like, important, like, side note. And then hearing you guys talk about like make the importance of this stuff before a fat loss phase makes me think about, Berta, what you were saying probably like 20 minutes ago about how, and we see it happen all the time, how after a fat loss phase, or when someone wants to get away from tracking, the questions and anxiety that can come of, okay, well, what do I do? Like, and really you don't really do anything different. You just keep up those same habits and that same structure, and you're just no longer tracking it. That's why there's that whole, video course around how to get away from tracking. But that's one of the big guidelines in that is like, once you finish a fat loss phase, regardless of what your goal is from there, maintenance or to shift back into a lean gaining phase or whatever, like, you just keep basically that same structure and just continue on with those same habits, unless, your schedule shifts, you get a new job or have a baby or something else, and you have to completely, but then you just really use the same principles we talked about throughout this whole podcast, then help you set up a new eating routine based on your new schedule. So it's kind of cool. I don't know, just you, regardless whether it's before a fat loss phase, during a fat loss phase, or after a fat loss phase, that structure and that I don't know is always important, and that's something that we said we all do year round, regardless.
I think we covered it.
Yeah, be prepared is the moral of the story. Like, you wouldn't not pre-plan your training. Why wouldn't you do a little of that when it comes to your nutrition?